Thank you, Ferdinand. Welcome everyone from my side as well. Thank you that you all showed up for our coffee break on startup investments. We did prepare a different start to today. I have to say that Fatlinda, who was announced as a moderator and the speaker of today's session, could not join because she lost her voice. I hope I'll be an adequate stand-in though for moderating and also presenting what we do at IoT Plus. I'm very, very happy and thankful to our today's speaker lineup, because when I asked whether people wanted to talk on hardware and IoT-based investments, I had people who readily said yes. That makes me always very, very happy, but more on that a bit later. We will be listening to different angles on investments and startups as well, different stages on investments and startups as well. And that basically brings me back to one of the underlying aspects of what we at IoT Plus wanted to do and aim to do, which is creating a business-focused ecosystem for companies and business professionals that deal with IoT and hardware-based companies and business models. So we go out, set out a program for companies, for example, for startups or for established companies. We have a network of companies that help those companies, and we try to support on every level of hardware development, but also software development and business challenges. Finding the right partners in a complicated technology environment is one of the major challenges that companies can face after they've gotten funding. And we are trying to address a lot of the underlying fundamentals of what you might be facing when you want to work with the Internet of Things. We did start about a year ago. We are going strong, and we have this series of coffee breaks, of which the idea is to have an interaction with the audience. So you may have noticed that we're recording this session. You can choose how you want to interact with us. You can raise your hand and ask to get a microphone or a screen share, and you're welcome to ask our panelists your question yourself, face-to-face. You can also use our chat messages, and then Fritjof in the background will sift through the messages and basically give rise to your voice. But before we get to that, first we need to get to a bit more content that we can discuss. And we have today 3 people: Tienko from Leapfunder, Brian Nee from ArkleyBrinc VC, and Mo from Redstone. And they have each a 5 to 7 minute time frame in which they can present what they do and how they do things. And we can discuss with them after. I'll be asking questions myself. No one has any, but I'm really looking forward to what our attendees actually want to say and have to say about this. And please, please feel free. Again, it's a coffee break. It's an exchange of ideas. And without further ado, I'll have a sip. And Tienko, the stage is yours. Please tell us about what Leapfunder does and angel investments in the hardware device space.
Okay, so I'm first. Okay, so my name is Tinko. I'm a Dutchie. I'm in Berlin a lot. You could have bumped into me in Berlin. And I work for a company called Leapfunder. Leapfunder is basically the European angel list. So it's an online angel club. It's got about 20,000 registered investors, but about 1,500 are actually active. So from 1,000 to 500,000 active. 1,500 angel investors. What we do for businesses that startups can list, you can actually list for free, and then you can go up. And obviously, if you actually start cash fundraising on our website, there's a commission. But there's an entry level that's free for all startups. Right. So we handle a lot of deals. Most of what we handle, so it's all informal investors, right? And runs are up to about 500,000. Most of what we handle is web and app. And the reason we handle mostly web and app is because our investors like it. Informal investors like business models that are highly scalable, because they'll grow quicker and they'll be able to sell them quicker. And they like business models where the sales can start and the growth can start before there's been a massive investment, so that you can put your investment in just after you've reached the success. You see this thing grow, you put some money, you see this thing grow, you put some money. Okay, so hardware is the opposite of those things. hardware grows relatively slowly, therefore exits will be later, and you need to put up a lot of money up front in order to have a product. Otherwise, you can't grow. So it's not that popular with informal investors, quite frankly. Hardware investment. The classical way of doing hardware investment and de-risking it in the eyes of investors is, or classical, I mean, for about 10 years, there's existed a golden route towards launching a hardware startup, and that's to sell it, so have revenue before you build it. So you sell it first, that means you've got growth, and then you build it later. And you can do that if it's a consumer product on a website like Indiegogo or Kickstarter, right? Obviously, pre-tailing, Start Next in Germany. And that's been massively successful. A company like Relayer, does everybody know Relayer? Right. Their golden move was to make a set of sensors in the form of a chocolate bar called the Wunder Bar, I think. And they put it on a pre-tailing website. It wasn't even Kickstarter or Indiegogo. And they sold a number of units. I can't remember how many, but all of a sudden they were a player. Right? And they just had to make those, I think they sold 200 or something. And all of a sudden they were a player, and they were able to snowball it from there because they had real product out there, they had real sales, there was a popularity, and so on and so forth. And of course, Relayer is a big success story. Right? And it went real quick. Okay. So that's a key to it. Now, if you don't have a consumer product and you can't just sell it on Start Next, you're actually in luck, because a better model is usually to find a big corporate customer, someone who's got such a big problem that they're willing to, that they just will pay for any solution, right? It's like the patient who's in pain who will pay you anything. So that if you've got an industrial party and they need some filter, otherwise they have to shut down a factory, then they'll pay you 100,000 up front to build one. Okay, so that's with consumer, you try to do pre-tailing, and with big corporate customers, you try to come up with a big, bulky prototype-like solution for. That just means you need to find the person who's got a problem so bad they're willing to pay up front for you to build a manual thing. And those are really the two channels that I see for hardware companies. First, do pre-tailing, and then build the units afterwards, or find a big corporate customer that's got such a big problem they'll pay you up front 40 or 50% in order to build them a big prototype. Then you've got revenues going through the business, you've got product going through the business, and then you have a starting point for conversations with investors. So that's an important part. Of course, the big bottleneck, and I guess I'll leave it for the next person. The big bottleneck that people encounter who've done a lot of pre-selling, especially consumer pre-selling, is that they sell 100 units of something on Kickstarter, and they've made 10,000, and suddenly they realize that setting up the tooling for the production is going to cost them $500,000. And that means you're now in a position where you've got to deliver 12,000 euros worth of goods, but you need a $500,000 investor in order to be able to do it. That means you're selling a problem to an investor. You don't want to go up to an informal investor and sell them your problem. Hi, I've got an idea. I've got a big problem. I don't want to make it your big problem. That's not really the conversation you want to be having. So in general, you try to stay away from that. And the tricks to stay away from it is, first of all, to sell a prototype on Kickstarter that you can make without expensive tooling. Just make it in the kitchen. We tend to tell hardware startups, make your first 10 in the kitchen and just sell them. And then you're a next level company. Or what you do is you try and hook up with potential investors before you do your Kickstarter. So they've made a soft promise that if you have a somewhat successful Kickstarter, they will invest an X amount, which means that you've got some level of certainty that you'll get the big investment after your Kickstarter. And those are the main routes that we advise. In general, we say, okay, good luck. If it's your destiny to do a hardware company, but it's really hard, right? It's harder than. On the other hand, you have fewer competition, right? If you make it. And some of the big successes that we've seen have been hardware companies, actually, like Relayer.
Thank you, Tinko.
Yep.
Let me just ask you a question, because I know that Relay moved away from producing hardware first and foremost, because the Wunderbar that they made, I've got one here actually, is quite a success story. But they also realized that just being a hardware company might not be enough, and you seem to be saying the same thing. Does that mean that hardware should or could next be a step in development?
Is a pain, because you've got a thing. It needs to sit in a distribution center. You need working capital. You need so actually a lot of companies try to say, can we do it like Dolby? You've got a lot of equipment which has Dolby written on it. They don't make equipment. They just sell that logo and a little bit of technology that goes in, and they get someone in China to do the manufacturing of the stuff. It just says Dolby on the box. If you can get to a point where you're just selling know-how, then that's actually a little cooler from a business model perspective.
It's interesting to say this without wanting to do too much advertising, but we have a hardware startup also in a network that is actually there. It's ready to sell the hardware and do projects. So for them, that step seemed to be more difficult than creating the hardware, because you want to go into interactions with your partners directly. But maybe just to not drag this out too much, let's come back to this discussion when we open it up for a three or like a three panelist discussion. When people get crowdfunded or angel invested, I think then they can move on with their initial investment, create a company, and are looking for their first investor. And maybe, Bryony, this is a good moment to get you in, because ArkleyBrinc has probably the means to be the first investor, don't they?
Yeah. So hi, everyone. I'm Bryony. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me today. Yeah, I think ArkleyBrinc VC is one of the few VCs in Europe that actually focuses on hardware and IoT, and we do prefer to be the first institutional investor in companies. So we do often invest in companies that have maybe been through an accelerator, so they maybe gave away a small amount of equity, or maybe they have some angel investment already. But yeah, we're normally the first VC coming in around 500,000 in our first investment, and then we can invest up to 1 million. So I'm just going to show a couple of slides to give you a bit of an introduction if you don't know me already. So I've been in the startup world for about 12 years now. I started off as a serial tech entrepreneur myself. So I've been in the shoes of being the one begging investors to please invest in my companies. And I raised a couple of million for my first significant software as a service startup that was in the smart mobility and transportation space. And then I transitioned over into IoT, and I had a digital health IoT startup. Yeah, and then I got into a more advisory role. So I've been running an accelerator for Brinc, who maybe you've heard of. Brinc started off focusing just in hardware and IoT, and now they cover almost everything, many different types of deep tech topics. They do a lot of food tech and agricultural tech, also clean energy, industrial IoT. They basically have an accelerator for everything now. And I run IXDS Labs, which is a spin-off of, well, maybe you know IXDS is a service design studio in Berlin. We did a spin-off for a couple of years as kind of an internal venture building, also for hardware and IoT. And then the last 2 to 3 years, I've been managing partner at ArkleyBrinc, which is kind of a joint initiative. Arkley was a hardware VC in Poland. And we've got some of the investors from Brinc on the board as well. Yeah, so that's where I'm at now. And we're investing into IoT and also some various deep tech topics, but there has to be a core focus in Poland. So that's one of our key criteria, because we're actually funded by the Polish Development Fund. So we can invest in European companies, but there has to be some kind of business activity in Poland. And besides that, I'm doing still some mentoring. FemGems, maybe you know, they're also a Berlin-based company. I do a lot of one-to-one mentoring for the women entrepreneurs there, and the Alchemist as well in San Francisco, for example, to get a bit of scope. Yeah, so it's interesting actually what Tinko was saying about Kickstarter and crowdfunding campaigns, because this is one of the words of warning I often give to early stage hardware startups, because I've seen so many fall completely on their faces by crowdfunding too early, because exactly like you said, Tinko, they have an intention or a timeline of when they think they'll be able to launch the product and how much it's going to cost. And then when they actually start building it, they find out that their estimations are very, very wrong. And unfortunately, if you started that crowdfunding too early, the people that should be your biggest evangelists become just kind of a bunch of people that are very annoyed at you because you haven't been able to deliver on your promise. So actually, when I'm advising startups, I say don't use crowdfunding as a way to raise money. It should really be to get those first early adopters and create a bit of buzz around your product just maybe a couple of months before you know you're going to launch. It shouldn't be a way to get cash in the company very early, because that can often go wrong and end up actually killing the company. So there's a lot of things, and maybe I'm preaching to the choir here. I'm sure that people on this call are already familiar that hardware comes with a lot of unique challenges that software or kind of platform-based companies don't have. I started off in the software as a service space, and most of the money that you raise from investors is normally used for hiring good developers and actually, just HR costs to build the product. But then, if you need to do bug fixes or iterate or add new features, just the whole process is a lot quicker and cheaper than if it's hardware. When you actually start doing physical prototyping of a physical device, if there's issues with it, you need to then rebuild as many iterations as it takes until it's perfect, and that can be very time consuming. Not to mention, of course, you need to find the right production companies or manufacturers. You need to set up your whole logistics and supply chain. Then you need to think about distribution, whether you're going to sell it actually physically in stores or just online, whether you need to have storage and warehouses for your stock. None of these things are any problems for software companies. So this is a bunch of reasons why investors are pretty scared of hardware and why a lot of them shy away from it. So if VCs don't have experience in this specific sector, these are kind of all big red flags and unknowns for them. So it's good to actually get someone on your side who knows the industry. But the good news is, I don't want to be a naysayer since I work in this industry. It's easier than it's ever been before to build hardware. We're getting more and more manufacturing possibilities in Europe. And it feels like the world is getting smaller with our networks all joining together. And of course, components are cheaper and easier and faster to produce. So it's a better time than it was ever before. But a few tips. I'll just scroll over these because I'm sure we can jump into more detail as part of a discussion. But the mistake I still see so many hardware startups doing is that they think they have a great idea and they start building it and spending the money and the time before they've actually validated the product market fit. It seems like a simple thing, but people still go, oh, right, yeah. It's more than just asking your friends or your family, would you buy this? Do you think it's cool? Because they're going to be biased. You actually need to properly test the hypotheses and make sure that there's market demand and customers that are willing to part with their money and actually pay for that product before you build it. Otherwise, you're going to kill the company. So that means
for Brian, sorry for me. You've got LOIs on your list still. So pre-orders, we're great believers in pre-orders, pilots, all that stuff, first revenue, right? But LOIs, do they still work for you guys? Do you still take them as evidence? Because we think LOIs are lying in the streets these days. We tell people it's nothing.
Yeah, it depends. So if it's a B2B business model, then they can have value. I would never look at an LOI from a B2C model. But with B2B, sometimes it's harder to get pre-orders because businesses are less willing to part with their money or to sign up for things if they're not already tried and tested, in my experience. If it's B2B models and the LOIs have some sort of grounds, for example, if they're doing a pilot actually with this customer, there's more chance that they're going to be able to convert them. So we would still look at that on a B2B model, yeah. But yeah, it's showing early traction. There's many different ways you can do it, but we need to see that there's some kind of interest. And of course, we have also been burned. We've had a portfolio company who I won't name that's not doing so well, who had some LOIs and they seem to have really interested parties and a lot of really interested people lined up. And then none of them they were able to convert in the end once the product launched. So it's not a guarantee, it's just an indication. But I think actually, Tienko, you would be a good person to talk more about the financials as well, the costs, risks, because it's another thing that we really want to see as well, looking at software compared to hardware companies. It's a lot more complex when you're actually planning to build hardware. And I always advise companies to put a really healthy buffer in there, both time and cost buffer, because there will inevitably be unexpected costs or things cropping up that you haven't planned for. So normally we send people away with their first version of the financial model and say, make it more conservative, put more of a buffer in, and then come back and let's see. Because it's great if you can outperform your financial plan, but if you don't hit the targets that you've set with your investors, then they're not going to be very happy. I think I won't go through all of these points right now, otherwise we'll have nothing left to talk about. But generally just leaving enough time and having enough runway to keep the company running while you raise a round is important, because if you're getting a bit more money from VCs, it takes longer than if you're going to an angel, for example. With an angel and a convertible loan agreement or a safe note, you can maybe close in a couple of weeks, but with a VC, we need a couple of months to do the proper due diligence and go through all of the legal investment agreements that are necessary for a proper fund. Well, not that any funds are not proper, but especially publicly funded ones like mine, there's a lot of red tape.
Bryony, let me say thank you. I think we should leave room for the discussion after, because especially the points that you raised around the cost, the planning, and of course the runway and the funding parts are, I think, really, really interesting and something that are underestimated very, very often. And I also have some general questions and question marks for later regarding B2C, B2B, and other things. But if I understand correctly, you say there are a couple of red flags with a public investor as well, but what are the benefits of coming to you? I mean, we have, of course, we have got the Poland frame that someone has to have, but why would I choose ArkleyBrinc versus someone who's not tied to a public investment fund?
Mainly because we have experience specifically in hardware companies. So both myself and my business partner have been working in that space for several years, and we have very good network, first of all, of the supply chain that you need. So we still work very closely with Brinc. So for example, if a startup company that we're working with has done a small batch of their first version of the product locally, in Germany or in Poland or somewhere here in Europe, and then at the point when they want to scale up, maybe they do want to move to China to make it more cost effective, we have a good network that we can plug them into. And also help them evaluate, do I want to go with the fastest or the cheapest or the best quality? What kind of partners am I looking for? So I think just having an understanding of what goes into building hardware is basically this industry knowledge, and the partnership networks that we have is the real value.
I think you're absolutely right. For anyone that doesn't know, who's watching this now, Brinc is a hardware accelerator initially founded in Hong Kong, with good connections to Shenzhen. So if you think about scaling your business case, that's a very good area to be in as well, and a good partner to have. And having that connection with ArkleyBrinc, I think, is quite unique overall, but just as an explanation. Right, so once they're through ArkleyBrinc, hopefully successfully, and not like the one that you mentioned, I think there is need for follow-on funding, and that could come from Mo at Redstone, I think. I'm not sure, Mo, maybe you want to say something about yourself, what you do, and how you've gotten where you are.
Yeah, absolutely. So hello, everybody. A little bit about myself. Essentially started off on the entrepreneurial side out of Kenya, ended up becoming what would be considered successful in an environment such as that, but didn't have the education to back it. So then became an engineer, and then ended up working in venture capital based out of London. But really what my role here at Redstone is as investment manager at Redstone. And in this respect, maybe just a few words which would sort of transition very well into the topic of the funds. So Redstone at its core started doing something called VC as a service. So just 2 words about what that is fundamentally large corporates always want to interact with the young ecosystem of startups, but typically struggle to do this quite effectively. And Redstone in the beginning has always looked to help facilitate this. And as a result, have more than 60 different corporates for which we do this for. And this basically translates into everything from sourcing, due diligence, portfolio management, and exit management on behalf of these large corporates. But due to success at that, what has happened, and in a positive way, is that we're now able to launch sector-specific funds. And in this respect, it's more the traditional element of funds, where now we have 6 different growing funds, and they relate everything from the one that I currently manage called Future Industry Ventures, which is more the deep tech, manufacturing tech, and translating all the way up to health tech, fintech, and prop tech. We have a venture debt fund. So really, if any of those fit your mandate, please, by all means, don't hesitate to reach out to us. For the topic of discussion here, which I was hoping as well to sort of expand on, was really what is the added value of an investor? And here, what I'm really talking about is entrepreneurs in the beginning think that the investor is there to run their business. That's not the case. Actually, the investor is there to help build your business. What do I mean by that? So on a day-to-day perspective, dependent on where the investor comes in, of course, the nature of that investor is very different. So what does that mean? In the case of seed funding, and again here, maybe my colleagues can also expand further on how they participate. The intention of that investor is really to create a business that a Series A plus investor would come in and invest. And how do they do that? So this is everything from making the business more streamlined with respect to how do they go to market, creating a better business case, a business model. And here there's a lot more potential interaction. Again, also the type of investor, again, is also very important. By this, what do I mean? Is that sometimes they only want to be a financial investor and they don't want any participation in the company. But there are some funds whereby they actually will take an active participation in the company. And maybe in the case of myself, for Future Industry Ventures, the aim of the fund is to help grow the business with the mandate that we have into the European landscape, as well as the East Asian market. Of course, we are very happy to help you grow into the North American market, but East Asian market is really, and Europe, really the goal of Future Industry Ventures. And how do we do this? So we don't come in saying, hey, we're going to take over the business and tell you how you need to run it on a day-to-day. No, what we do tell you is, hey, show us where the skeletons are and let us sort of brush them out. So what does this mean? So typically you'll hear the keywords of always KPIs, and what are KPIs specific to the industrial companies? Much of the time, deep tech companies and manufacturing tech companies are really good at technology. But what they're not good at is sort of the operational aspects, the financial aspects, and really just the interaction of marketing, sales. These are the areas where they typically need more support. And as a result of being an investor that is looking to grow this business into, a global scale, what we're trying to say is, okay, you are struggling with marketing. How best do we help you with that? From the experience of the investors who have had multiple portfolio companies and have seen this, they're able to provide input to help you better make a decision on where you need to be. And they'll put in a KPI saying, by the end of X, you need to have done Y. So my intent for this discussion was really to say, please be sure of what you're going to do with an investor. The investor is not there to run your business again. They're there to help build your business.
Thanks, Mo. I have also a question for you, because you talk about an investment from a strategic point of view, which means how could the investor help me? What could I ask the investor? I've come to know that some companies have looked for a pure financial investor, basically with the opposed attitude of just give me my money, but don't tell me what to do. Is that a good idea? What would you recommend to people like this? From what you're saying, I would assume that wouldn't be you then. That would be potentially someone else.
Again, it depends on the nature of the investor. From my perspective, as a fund manager for Future Industry Ventures, our mandate is to actively participate in the company to help build it. So we're not looking to just give you money. We're looking to give you money, but also say, how do we help make you a better company from the perspective of your business plan, your product development, etc. However, on the other case, as the companies grow, for example, at a Series C stage, there's only so much that an individual investor can do. This would probably be, for example, better network. This is really where the core the advantage of investors in the later stage would really provide. Maybe some operational aspects and sort of streamlining and sort of cost cutting and how to better make that company sort of, cost efficient. But the company has already been set up. It's been doing its thing. And there, many of the investors are more financial and probably also strategic, because at the end of the day, some of those strategics will be the acquisition point. So just to answer your question more concisely, from the perspective of future industry ventures, it is to be not just a sort of monetary investor, but actually an active investor that helps grow the company.
Yeah, I agree. I would have probably used financial investment versus smart investment versus versus the strategic investment that you mentioned. And I think those three terms basically, or those three investment types, also change and differ over time and maturity of a company, depending on what's needed. Because from what I see, we have now gotten from where you begin, if you have hardware, where you begin with hardware and you might struggle to get the prototypes off the ground, you move over to, more and more what you do, and you're trying and needing to expand, and you have challenges facing your company that happen when you grow. By the way, for everyone who's listening in, we do accept hand raises, video questions, audio questions, and written questions. This is supposed to be an interaction, and we're going to go to a more panelized situation here. So please feel free to ask at any point. I will definitely make a start and open the discussion with all three of us. And what drives me so much, and I just happen to know that all three of you, thank you for being here, by the way, again, all three of you know me and have known me for quite some time. What drives me is that the question, isn't hardware trivial nowadays? And shouldn't you be focusing on the business case, because you could use any hardware you like at any point of time? And with that idea, who wants to go first? Who wants to start and crack the nut of, is hardware trivial, and isn't IoT about not hardware, but the business case?
I can kick off if you want. Oh no?
Bryony. Tienko's muted still.
Okay. Yeah, that's one of the things actually that I found a bit off-putting when I first got into the IoT industry, that 5 years ago, there was still a lot of kind of gimmicky consumer products that don't really have any longevity in terms of the customer lifetime value. And I found that a bit off-putting. And what else I found off-putting was I didn't like the idea of a smart home in my house because I was like, I don't want my things listening to me. In Germany here, I think we're much more privacy conscious than some other countries. And so some people have questioned, why are you investing in IoT if that's the way you feel? So me as an individual, I'm actually a lot more interested in B2B cases. I think there's still a lot that can be done with things like remote maintenance and, in an industrial environment where it can bring a lot of value. But that's not to say, there can be IoT companies that are kind of software or platform based that are using off-the-shelf existing hardware products. And yes, that can be a lot faster and cheaper to build that way, but there's still incredible technology being invented using hardware that I haven't seen before. So I wouldn't say it's trivial, especially if you look in the medical and the health tech space. There's a lot still going on here. So I think it depends what sector you're looking at. So maybe it's becoming a bit more trivial in the consumer side, but when you look at the business cases, and yeah, maybe more deep tech, biotech sectors, there's still some really exciting innovations.
Thank you. You wanted to say something as well?
Well, I think maybe you're referring to this existence of these sort of programmable devices where I have something, a really cool piece of hardware, and I can make it do whatever, right? Because it's got a screen and a brain. So yeah, so apps and stuff, and that's really cool. In a sense, I think some of the biggest opportunities are in hardware. It's extremely difficult to do hardware well because need for working capital and manufacturing, and you have to ship it from China. It's a lot harder. But in a sense, any kind of programmable device, if you make a program, then someone else can copy the functionality, right? It's always going to be high competition. Of course, with the internet, we had a lot of opportunity because people setting up platforms where it's two-sided, and so it is sticky. You can't just walk away from eBay, right? But or Booking or whatever. So there's been lots of opportunities, but ultra long term, you could argue hardware is actually the densest technology, right? It's not some easily copyable thing. If you're actually good at it, you're right. And what do we eat in the world without hardware, right? And in particular, I would have said the consumer space is exciting. I think the coming period of time, because of quantified self. Right, it's become so much more critical. It's two things: the climate change and the energy problem has created a lot of hardware opportunities, electric cars and so on and so forth. And then quantified self, right? Because we're all eating too much and not getting enough exercise, and it is constant. We actually need a lot more stuff on our body. Traditionally, we just measure our weight on the scale in the bathroom, but we should be measuring a million things. And for anything that touches you, that you're interacting with as a human, the exact design of the hardware is completely critical, right?
I think you're right in that sense. You're also going in the route of health tech, so to say, which makes sense, right? You have to have a certain amount of customization. You have to have a certain amount of data gathering that is very, very personal, very, very applicable in the long run. If I look into topics that Mo has, for example, with future industries, like Mo, would you invest in a company that has one piece of hardware and that it might have to exchange every year because it gets outdated tomorrow?
It's an interesting question. First of all, we do invest in hardware, but hardware with a software component. This is sort of the ideal situation for us. But let me just also answer the question you posed, if whether hardware was still relevant. I want to just put it out there, like the internet, what we're using right now, is built on top of hardware. You know, without the backbone of hardware, we wouldn't have this. So hardware is extremely relevant. It's just from a business case, it's how best to implement hardware such that you can derive the best outcome. This is where the key sort of source is. And if you're able to do that efficiently and effectively, you have a winner. So the second part of your question, which was, would we invest in a company that needs replacement? We sort of have, in a way. So one of our portfolio companies is Flyability. It's a drone-based inspection company doing extremely well and very relevant to the market. Drones in itself are changing day by day. And this is a facilitator of what they're doing, but the core competency of what they're doing is being able to implement the hardware for a very specific reason. And of course, this changes, but what's layered on top also gives them the edge, which is fundamentally the inspection-based software. And so just to bring it into a close, like hardware is still very, very relevant. It's just how you bring it into the market that makes the difference.
The business case is key, I take it, because when we say hardware, it's of course a big spread. Tienko is thinking about devices on the body, for example. Brian is elegantly just skipping between different aspects of hardware, which is quite nice. I think, Mo, you're looking at it from the larger sense of like, if I can iterate on the hardware and it makes sense financially for the business case, you can implement, you can use it, you can upgrade, which is quite interesting because we've also seen a trend for hardware to become cheaper and cheaper and more specialized and more specific at the same time. I still recall 6 or 7 years ago that we had those moments of you can, I think the chip production could go down to $1 and less. And when you do this, of course, hardware doesn't become more trivial, it becomes more basic, fundamental, and affordable for each and every business application. Now, our session today is about startup investments, right? I know that I've been talking about hardware a lot, and I know that all three of you are IoT hardware focused to a certain extent. But in terms of investments and a successful business case, maybe we want to open up the floor a bit on the B2C, B2B discussion, with, of course, the background of we're talking about hardware. But hang on a minute, I see that Machiel is having a question. So maybe before we go to B2C, B2B, let's hear your question first.
Thank you. Good day, everybody. How's it going? Good? The thing is, we actually have the lottery ticket. We have the dog leash invention. So the dog, when he needs to poop, he will put it straight into the bag in a telescopic system. So it will not go on the ground. And we've patented it. And we have a subscription model, and we will keep the environment really clean. It started from a problem. I broke my leg, was walking my dog on crutches, and then I thought, what the hell am I doing here? And there came the invention, and we did everything in-house with my colleague, 3D printing, designing, making models, designing, and now we've got design full stop. We've got the final production. We're starting next week, and we start selling. So we did everything ourselves until today. So
Congrats.
what are we missing? Why aren't we funded yet? So happy for input.
Are you looking for angel funding?
Yeah.
Okay, so you did a couple things wrong there already in this conversation. The two things that stand out for me is Bryony made a point. You got to put your product in the hands of users.
We did already.
Right. Well, they mentioned that up front, because if it sounds like you and your friend were making it by yourselves and giving each other feedback and interacting with your dog, then that's narrow. So you want to be telling a story about how you put 100 leashes into the hands of the local dog club, and after 2 weeks they didn't want to go back, so they bought them from you. So consumer interaction. And the other is you use the word invention. And on our platform, I would have told you never use that word again, because an invention is a guy in the shed trying to get away from his wife who thinks he's got a brilliant thing and goes and requests a patent. And that guy is not the starting point of a company. You want to be a designer, you don't want to be an inventor.
Okay, cool.
So if you guys can project that these dog leashes are out there, to be honest, a dog leash, if you guys, are you able to produce in any volume?
Yeah, we do. No worries.
Then just start selling them.
We do already. We're actually starting doing that. We sold 5 yesterday to Canada. So Canada is.
So next time you open your mouth with any investors anywhere near, start talking about your sales numbers. Emphasize your growth, not the absolute numbers.
Okay.
And then I promise you, if you keep talking about your sales and they keep growing, then sooner or later they'll all want to be your friend. And then again,
then we can do it
the other way
ourselves. That we
around.
don't need any investor actually.
Sorry?
Then we can do it ourselves. We don't need anybody. So.
Well, you don't. It's always cooler to sell your product than it is to sell your shares. If you don't need investors, then don't touch investors.
Okay. That's our answer. Then go for it. Good. Thanks.
Yeah, I've talked to quite a lot of startup founders who are in this period of they're saying, do I need investors? Do I want investors or not? And actually it loops back to something I think it was Mo was saying earlier, that sometimes there's the fear that if you bring investors on board, they're going to want to try and control your company and interfere in the day-to-day operations. And that's simply not the case in my experience, especially considering, depending on the amount of money that you want, because maybe you can do it without any external financing. But if you want to scale faster and bigger, then you need money to do that. But if an investor is a minority shareholder, then they don't have the right to actually interfere in the day-to-day operations. They can make recommendations and suggestions. But I think it's really good to get smart money on board who can actually help you scale by introducing you to different network connections. Like I'll be happy to introduce you to one of our portfolio companies called Dr. Pet Care. And they specialize mostly in kind of nutritious pet food that they've developed with animal nutritionists and veterinarians and health supplements basically for your pets. But they have a lot of connections to different e-commerce networks and platforms that are selling pet care products. Could be a good hookup for you, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. Right. So B2B, B2C. I think part of the background of why I'm so interested in this is we've seen a lot of companies and ideas in the B2C space first when it comes to IoT. And also, I mean, today we already talked about, for example, the dog leash, which is a consumer-based topic. But we've also talked about Arena, for example, who started with a window bar, a hardware kit that was not necessarily focused at business clients, and then later switched to business clients. I would actually like to openly hear what you guys think about the B2C, B2B distinction and where IoT and where investments are headed. Are they more B2C focused as they so to say, used to be in Berlin and Germany with the e-commerce revolution of the early 2000s, or and now moving into B2B, or is the money, or has it always been in B2B? And I know this is a depending on what kind of view and angle you come from question, but I think it's still something very interesting to discuss, as we have multiple different companies with different backgrounds here, and hearing some input from people who actually give money and how they view the markets might help people to define and outline their own markets in their pitch decks. So I'll open the stage. Who wants to go first?
I can give a perspective in terms of geographies and how different I've seen the willingness to adopt these kind of products.
Please do.
Yeah, so I'm from the UK originally, so I launched my first business in London. I've been living in Berlin on and off for 9 years, mostly on. And then I worked at Brinc in Bahrain, which was a completely different market that I didn't know, which is in the Gulf region in the Middle East, if you're not sure. And now working in Poland. So I've had a bit of kind of perspective from these different places, and then working with Brinc in Hong Kong as well. Now, if you go somewhere like Hong Kong, you'll find that with B2C products, people are very early adopters over there. It's a very kind of high tech savvy nation where people are, willing to try new products and happy to show off the latest version of whatever, piece of hardware they've got. Whereas when I went to Bahrain, the kind of not only technology, but the whole startup ecosystem was completely brand new. Everything was nascent. And so there needed to be a lot of education done to the very kind of basic level of what is IoT? What does it mean? What is a startup? What's the difference between a startup and an SME? And so it was a lot more difficult to convince people to try something there because everything was just like too new. Whereas when I was in Bahrain, I saw some really ripe opportunities for B2B IoT innovations because they have huge industry there. So they've got oil and gas, they've got property development as probably the two biggest industries, where I would like to see a lot more kind of employee safety and wellness measures happening that are not currently happening. And of course, remote maintenance, where you've got a lot of kind of outdoor, especially with oil and gas, like miles and miles of piping in the deserts that you can't have somebody watching the whole thing the whole time. So I saw a lot of opportunity for B2B innovation there, but there was a lot of reluctancy around the B2C. Whereas, yeah, if you're somewhere that's more tech savvy, it's easier for B2C.
Know your market, yeah.
I mean, I would second that. I think B2B it goes back to this trick that I said, that if you're selling hardware, then find somebody who's got so much pain they're willing to buy it even in an experimental stage. You will find businesses who have got a big problem, right? Because they're running a factory and it's not safe, or they're not, they're on one of our most successful IoT companies has a tracker for the little carts on the airport. Those go all over the place, right? Nobody knows where they are. So they've got a little thing so they can talk to each other and they can, okay. So a business that has a big problem is willing to invest in an expensive system that will solve it and that they can maintain. Consumer is weird. It's a strange space. Our habits don't evolve that quickly. And people have been talking about IoT in the house. I used to work for a company called Philips. And I was always like, why don't our electric toothbrushes just talk to my phone, because my phone's got much better software and it can just run the toothbrush when they're near, right? But they still don't, right? The toothbrush is a separate intelligence from your phone, from your and so on. So there's only very little of that breaking through. I think because the pain isn't that big around the house. You don't really need it, and then why have a high-tech solution if there's no problem? So I think B2C is tougher than B2B sometimes, but all that's very general, right? I mean, you have to look at your specific product, obviously.
Yeah, maybe I'll close off from the investor perspective with a statement on. I think B2B is still a very relevant cash for us, for the startups essentially. But maybe if we just rephrase the context and say, from an IoT perspective, what is the most relevant pain that was also raised? If you think about it, what has been happening recently that's a key pain for IoT? It's cybersecurity. So that's not necessarily a specific hardware component, but it's hardware components that apply to both B2B and B2C. And then you look at the markets. This way, then you can see where a specific solution to a problem is then raising the case of both markets being interesting. So I don't necessarily think B2C is a market for me, for example, but if the pain, as was described, is there and can be implemented in a specific way, then it becomes interesting.
Thank you for that. I think cybersecurity and IoT is a extremely interesting field at the moment. I keep talking to more and more cybersecurity companies focused on the Internet of Things, so focused on things and software security built on top of hardware, which actually goes full circle then back to hardware design can be crucial for the security and the safety of an application, which then in the end will be interesting again for the business case itself, because where you could get away with some unsecure hardware in some respects, there are a lot of fields where you just can't. But that's just a sidebar. If you look at the B2C versus B2B scaling opportunities, because if you talk about investments, I think you talk about where's this headed and how well can this be scaled, right? I would like to maybe just in a quick short answer from each one of you here, what's a more scalable solution, or what's scaling short and mid to long term like in B2C versus B2B investments, according to your opinion? Let's start with Mo this time, because you just ended on this space.
So maybe you can frame the question for me again.
Yes, B2B versus B2C. What do they look like in terms of how you can scale your business model? In B2B, do you scale quickly and then you're up there? In B2C, do you scale quicker? What's easier to pull off, so to say, if we were to look at it from a company perspective, company startup perspective?
I would say B2C, if you have a very good land and grab, because it's a fast market. B2B, I would say, would have the biggest opportunity for revenues, given that the client base has a lot more to spare. But the caveat is the B2B market is dependent on the specific market, is a lot slower. So it's not a black and white. It's very gray.
Yeah, thank you. Tienko?
Yeah, so yeah, I usually say when we're talking about B2C or consumer products, I still call them consumer products because we're talking about physical things right now, is if you look around the house, look around your house, you will find very few products that are made by a startup. Most of your products are made by Sony or Samsung or Philips or some huge company. Right? The very few products that that are made by startups is probably a Fitbit. Here's a Fitbit. You might have Sonicare was once actually a startup, was bought by Philips, but Philips Sonicare toothbrushes or Sonicare was a startup. You might have an Apple, right? And that is actually sort of a startup-ish, 40-year-old startup, but a 50-year-old startup. But for the most part, products that you buy that are hardware, you buy them from big companies that made it as a tiny part of their product line. And that's to do with consumers liking to go to media markets to buy it. That's to do with having to provide repair services. That's to do with having to produce a manual in every language of the world. And the logistics of getting a consumer product out there are very, very tough to get out. People just buy them for Christmas. So you have to make loads of them, sell them over Christmas. What if you don't? Startup has all the product in the shelves and they have to throw it away. I mean, big company can afford to do that, right? Make a lot for Christmas. So B2C consumer products tend to be the domain, unfortunately, of startups, of big companies. That means it's the path to market is something like you do a moderate success with a consumer product and you try and make sure that Philips buys you. And that is a viable path. I think it's sort of a winner takes it all type thing. It's like that's trying to become a movie star or something. Whereas a B2B product, you can find someone who's got so much pain they're willing to buy it right now and make it for them. And then the question is not whether you're going to sell. The question is whether it's scalable. And maybe it's just 10 companies, right? And then you're stuck with it. But at least you have a business. Whereas with consumer, it's kind of all or nothing. And it's kind of scary to me. Yeah.
So do I hear correctly that you would recommend that Machiel actually gets investment to take the market?
Sorry?
Would you recommend to Machiel, who's got the dog leash, who talked earlier, that he should get investment in order to take the market?
Well, I can't judge whether he should get investment or not, but if he's able to sell them online now, go and sell them right away, because if you've made sales, if you get investment, you'll get it at a better price. So go sell them, make them in your kitchen. That'll boost your share price right away. So in any case, go sell them.
True,
Whether you need investment is kind of, it depends on your plan. But a typical path is that you sell them, it turns out to be a cool thing, and then suddenly you get an email from Nike saying, we've been thinking about expanding into dog wear or whatever, right? Something like that will happen. That's
look at Nest.
Yeah, like Nest. They're Sonicare toothbrushes. And that's a kind of a cool path, but you're very much dependent on this counterparty, right? Because it's so difficult to go to the consumer directly. So to be honest, if for dog leashes, it's tough, but it is safer to make a really cool dog leash and do a huge contract with the police or something, right? So if that, you see anything, that's a little bit more predictable.
I can see Tienko and Machiel talk after the session. But Bryony, let us just hear you also on this topic real quick. What do you think? What's faster successful, a B2C or B2B company?
I definitely lean more towards B2B. I agree a lot with what Tienko said. With B2C, you have to convince a lot more people, and there's a lot lower value per customer. So you need to be really, really good at marketing, and you need to be very quick to market. And usually, as Tienko was saying, you would need to have it already in your exit strategy that you expect to be acquired by one of these larger corporates. Because with consumer products, that's your competition, is these major corporates who have a much deeper pockets than you have. So you can try to play to your strengths that only startups have, that you can be more fast and more agile and, innovate more quickly. But at the end of the day, to try and beat one of these major corporations is a bit of a pipe dream, I would say. Whereas, businesses do still have very real problems that need to be solved. So I definitely gravitate more towards the B2B business models. And as well, I think when you're doing consumer products, you need to really think about the defensibility. So even if you have a patent, that does not necessarily mean that, a company in China can't copy you and execute much faster, and then you end up kind of with something tied up in court for 2 years. By then you're already bought out of the market. So, it might only offer you some protection, but it doesn't actually stop anyone copying you in the end. So I think the more sensible approach to defensibility is actually, I think what Mo was saying earlier, is having, some kind of software ecosystem around the product. So it's not purely hardware, but it's actually more kind of a platform with a hardware component.
Thanks, Bryony. I think this concludes our hour. Thank you to all of you, Bryony, Mo, Tienko. Thank you to the audience who participated. Thank you for the audience who listened. I hope this was interesting to you, and we'll move on actually to more industrial and agricultural topics this fall. So stay tuned for announcements of the next coffee breaks. I'm hoping to see you there again. Thanks, everyone, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks, Falco.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.